We're going through some introduction to Blender tonight, and we're going to jump straight into it. So, some quality of life things that we want to go through. First of all, this window will pop up the first time that you open Blender. So there's not a whole lot that you have to change here. Two things that I recommend you just double check are making sure you have select with your left mouse button checked, and you have search with spacebar checked. These aren't critical things, but if you use the original Blender defaults, right mouse click is your select option, which is really confusing for people that are used to pretty much every other program where left clicking will select anything. And then the spacebar selection, you can really use any of these. Search is just easier because if you hit spacebar and start typing in a command, you might not know that there's a specific command that exists in Blender, but you can start typing it, and odds are if you start typing in something that you want to do, whatever the command is named is exactly what it does. So for example, maybe you don't know if there's a chamfer tool, but you start typing chamfer and then something comes up for that in Blender. So it's nice to have that as a quick hotkey that you can use with spacebar, as opposed to play or tools, which are more useful as advanced things, but for basic Blender stuff, this is easier. Another thing is making sure that you have your graphics card enabled to be used if you have a nice graphics card. So if you have something by NVIDIA, that's usually supported. So what you're going to want to do is after you save these original starting settings in Blender, it'll open up into your default view, and then you can go into Edit, Preferences, and your System tab. And then there's right here at the top, the Cycle Render Devices. You can check through these different tabs and enable any graphics cards that you have that are nice here. And this will just speed up your rendering process. So there's a couple different options. None will be selected by default in Blender. And if you don't have a supported graphics card, it will also just stay on none. And then CUDA is your general purpose one. So this is any nice graphics card, but maybe it's not explicitly for rendering things. It's just a nice gaming graphics card. That'll usually be under the CUDA option. Optics is a new kind of experimental feature in Blender. This is specifically for graphics cards with RTX capabilities in them. This is better for ray tracing features, which is something that you do in certain rendering setups. So you can enable that one. And then OpenCL is another option as well. And they go in order from lowest speed to highest speed. So you might as well check through this when you open up Blender and see if you have any options that you can select in here for faster rendering. And then a last thing is download a shortcut reference sheet. These aren't 100% necessary, but Blender is kind of like Photoshop, where there's a ton of different tools all over the place in the interface. And it can get kind of frustrating trying to remember all of the different shortcuts and hotkeys if you're a beginner just starting out. So I recommend these two different reference sheets, and I'll post the link in the Zoom chat for you guys if you want to download them while we're going through. But yeah, these are just two different reference sheets. Some of them, each of them cover a little bit different stuff on them. But these cover some of the most important, most used keys that you're going to go through while you're using Blender. So why use Blender? There are three main reasons that you'd really want to use Blender as opposed to some other software. So you have greater control over rendering your images. If you want something to look really nice, have fancy lighting setups, maybe you want some kind of transparency or lighting emit, like light coming out of your object, something like that, and you want to look really intricate. Blender has a lot of great controls for that. You can do some really complicated setups for it if you want to get super advanced and make things look exactly photorealistic. Another really great use case for it is organic modeling and sculpting. So Blender wasn't originally designed exclusively for digital sculpting, but it's been a feature that people have wanted for a long time. So it's been developed more and more each version of Blender. And the current version has pretty strong sculpting tools built into it. So if you're trying to do something that's a little bit more freeform, maybe you want something like a mouse that's ergonomic, that fits to your hand better, or you're going for something that's pure sculpting, so you're sculpting out a video game character or anything like that that's all curves and no hard edges, Blender has built-in sculpting capabilities that are really nice for that. That would be very difficult to do in a traditional CAD modeling program where you have to do things with curves and surfaces and splines, which get really gross. And then a third reason that you'd want to use Blender is editing mesh files produced by other programs. So, for example, maybe somebody produces a file for you in a CAD program, and they want you to change it around, and they give you an STL file from their CAD program, and they don't give you the CAD file. If you try to edit an STL file in a CAD program like SolidWorks or Fusion 360, it's doable, but it's really frustrating. They're not very well suited for editing meshes, but Blender creates meshes as its default file, so it's able to edit any STL that you're sent really easily. This is ideal, especially if you have files from, for example, Thingiverse, where it's all STL files pretty much exclusively. You can download files like that off the internet and make changes to it without having to struggle by importing it into a CAD program that doesn't handle it as well. So what is mesh modeling? This is what makes Blender different from your standard CAD programs like you have, like Fusion 360 or SolidWorks. Instead of building out something as a sketch that is then made into a solid body, Blender makes everything as a mesh from the very beginning. So basically, you're adding on points that are connected to each other. And because of this, you have dimensions in your model, but it's not the same as a traditional CAD program where you type in a dimension and then you can always go back and change that dimension to a different value and it'll auto update for you. That's not something that really happens with mesh modeling. You can still go back and change things, but it's a lot trickier to make things automatically change, and you can't really design things with parameters as easily as you would in a traditional CAD program. And your building blocks are planes and points that are connected together. So by default, your models that you create in a mesh are not going to be watertight. You have the potential for holes to be inside of your part or things to overlap with each other. So if you're used to modeling in a CAD program where everything is solid and you can just export it to an STL and it's going to be nicely ready to go for 3D printing, all watertight, you're going to have to put in a little bit more extra work planning in Blender to make sure that you don't end up with something that will break when you try and 3D print it. So we're going to go through three critical things for the works that you need to know about the workspace before we move in and just jump straight into a demonstration in Blender. Your rotation is your scroll wheel. So if you click and hold on your scroll wheel while you're in your general layout tab on your Blender workspace, you can rotate around your model. Zooming is just scrolling your scroll wheel up and down, and then panning is holding shift and clicking down your scroll wheel. So do you guys have any questions for me now before we jump into a demonstration of the tools in Blender? Okay. So we're going to jump back into Blender now. So when you open Blender after you've opened it for the first time, if you open it again after that, it's going to bring up your nice little home menu here. So this is where you can either start a new file type or open one of your recent ones. In general, you can pretty much make any type of file that you want from the general tab. These ones are different specialized setups that you can do. So 2D animation, sculpting, VFX, video editing. These ones, you can still go back into a general layout if you accidentally click on one of those, but you wanted to make something that wasn't specifically sculpting, for example. It's just going to load you into a default setup that is more convenient for one of those setups. But we're going to use general for this. So when you open general, this is what you're going to be met with first. So this is what's called the default cube. Every time you make a new Blender file in a general setup, it's going to load in the default cube. You can either start off with this and use it for your editing, or you can delete this out and add in whatever other things that you want. We're going to keep it for a little while, and I'll go through showing you guys some stuff using this default cube. So The first thing that we want to cover is a couple of the quick shortcuts that you want to keep in mind when you're doing stuff in Blender. So the first one is W is your selection tool. So if you continue hitting W, you'll notice that it's going to toggle your selection ability up here between the different selection options. So right now I have select in a circle, so I can kind of paint with it. This is the one that I usually leave it on most often, select lasso. So you can just draw a lasso tool and it'll select whatever's inside of that. That's one of the most useful ones. There's a couple others in here. So select as a point or just as an object, select in a rectangular box. Yeah, we can leave it as point for right now. The next shortcut that we want to go through is hitting R will allow you to rotate an object. So if I just select the default cube and then hit R, it's going to kind of orbit it around its center of mass at the center there. You can see that orange kind of point in the middle is its center of mass. It's going to rotate around that. And right now it's not a super helpful rotation, so I can right click to cancel that. Whenever you're doing a tool, if you right click, it's going to cancel whatever transformations you were doing to it. So I can hit R again to go back into rotation, and then instead of letting it just rotate around freely like that, you can then hit X, Y, or Z to rotate around that axis. So for example, if I hit X now, you'll see that the X axis here, this red one, kind of highlights, and now if I rotate, it's rotating around that X axis. I can also switch over to Y or Z just by hitting on those respective letter keys on the keypad. And then again, right click will cancel and go back to its default orientation. Along those same lines, that's rotation. What if you want to do movement? So movement is hitting the G key on the keypad. So again, by default, it's just going to kind of allow you to free drag it around wherever your mouse is, but you can also hit X, Y, or Z to snap it to one of those directions. And you can go from one to the other. So if I, for example, hit Z, bring it up here, click, it'll stay in place, and then I can hit G and X, move it along the X axis to move it back here. So those are your two basic controls. Another one that can be helpful is Shift D. So Shift D will allow you to create a duplicate of your model and drag it off to the side. So maybe you really like what you've got right now and you want to try out adding something onto it, but you don't want to screw up what you've already got. You can always make a duplicate of your model and then make changes to your duplicate and then save your original one in your scene collection up here and not worry about screwing that up if you make something that's kind of breaks your model. So what is most useful to do with that is to make a duplicate like this, drag it over to the side, but don't click your left mouse, click your right mouse. And then you'll notice up here in the collection, it still made the duplicate of the cube, but it's right on top of the other one. So for example, if I hit G to drag this one out, you'll see that there's two cubes there. So what you can do then is hide one of them by clicking on this eye icon up here in your scene collection and hide one of them, and then just make your edits to your copy without having to worry about screwing up your original at all. So we'll just delete out one of those. And now this is one of your main shortcuts that you're going to use in Blender, Shift A. Shift A brings up this add menu. So this is where you can add in new stuff to your scene. So you have your mesh tab where you can add in new primitives. So for example, you can add in another default cube, or you could add in a bunch of other ones. So we have planes, circles, spheres, two different types, UV spheres. If we look at those, UV spheres have square meshes all the way around it, or you can add in a icosphere, which is made out of triangles instead. In general, it's better to edit with square meshes in Blender than it is with triangles. Most STLs are made out of triangles because it's a more efficient packing shape, but it's not great for making edits in a program like Blender, it's better to use squares. So if you're ever adding in a sphere, it's better to use a UV sphere unless you specifically need a shape like an icosphere. You can also add in other shapes in here. So there's cylinders, cones, torus. They have their kind of mascot monkey shape. So you can use this if you want to experiment with a specific texture that you're playing around with. You want to see how it would look on a complex shape. You can also add in other things that aren't meshes. We're not going to really go into those today, but for example, you can add in another light. So by default, when you load in a new general file, it's going to give you this one light here. You can always add in more lights to get different lighting setups like you would in a studio with different lighting setups that you do in person. So one thing to note here, if you hit A, that selects everything in your scene. And then you can just click off to the side and that will deselect everything. One thing to note especially is when you're in your default view, when you hit A, it selects everything that's in your view entirely. So it's going to select this light, it's going to select this camera, it's not just going to select your 3D models that you have in here. So you want to keep that in mind. So if you wanted to select everything and delete right now, that would clear it out, but it would also get rid of your camera and your lighting. So then if you wanted to render something later on, you'd have to add a camera and a light back in. So just be mindful of that. But A is a good one to remember that it will select everything for you. One last thing in the overall views before we go into actually making some changes to our default cube. If you have a keyboard with a number pad on it, the number pad is super helpful in Blender. It allows you to quickly toggle between different views so that you can look at things a little bit more easily. So if you're familiar with 3D modeling in a CAD program, for example, there's the setup of front, right, and top views as isometric views where you can basically flatten down your model and look at it from one side at a time. And you can toggle between that really quickly with the number pad. So pressing 1 on the number pad will bring you into the front view. Pressing 3 will bring you to the right view. Pressing 7 will bring you to the top view. And then pressing 5 will toggle between having perspective and having isometric view where there's no perspective of your models. It's usually better to have no perspective while you're doing your modeling, and then when you want to set up your rendering, you can turn on perspective because your render will use perspective whether you have it toggled or not. You can also hit 9. 9 will flip your view 180 degrees. So say, for example, I press 3 to move to the right view. Let's say I want to look at the left view. I can hit 9 and it's going to spin it 180 degrees around, and now this is the left view. It's not super obvious on a cube, but it is nice if you want to quickly switch back and forth. You can also hit 0. 0 will go into the camera view. So this is what your camera sees. And this will give you an easy way to see if your object is still in frame in your camera, and allow you to set things up in your screen. So let's say I want this to be closer to the camera. I can click on the default cube and hit G, and then drag this around. Oh, there's still a second cube, so we'll just delete that one out. We can drag this one around, and we can bring that closer to the camera by dragging this around closer, make it closer up to your camera here. And then if you rotate back around, you can go back out into your main view. So hitting 0 again will bring you into that camera view to allow you to see exactly what your camera sees, and anything inside this kind of dotted line is what will be rendered if you hit render for a final image. So those are some basic controls. Do you guys have any questions here before we start going into edits? All right. So we're going to go into some editing tools. This is what you're going to do. Your bulk of your changes in Blender will be in the edit mode. So to do that, you select your model that you want to edit, and then you hit Tab, and that will bring you into the edit workspace. And you'll notice that on the side here, you have these basic controls here. So for example, you have your move, rotate, scaling tools. If you hit Tab, this toolbar expands and brings out a bunch more tools, and you see your view kind of changes as well. So there are three basic principles for editing. You can either edit vertices, you can edit edges, or you can edit faces. Those are your three options that you can select. And you can really quickly switch between them by just pressing 1, 2, or 3 along the top of your keyboard, not the number pad, the just top of your keyboard, 1, 2, 3. So if you hit 1, that's your vertex selection mode. If you hit 2, this brings you into selecting edges, and then 3 allows you to select faces. And you can switch between them depending on what you're trying to do. In general, faces is probably one that you'll be using most often, but sometimes you want to switch over into edges or vertex depending on what you're trying to do. So let's go through a couple of the most used options in your editing mode. One of the most important ones is right here on the side. So this is your loop cut tool.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How did you switch into edit mode again?
Yeah, so that's when you hit tab. You select your object that you want to edit, and then you hit tab. So yeah, that's always a really important one to keep in mind. You'll be switching in and out of edit mode all the time the more you use Blender, so you'll get accustomed to that pretty quickly, but it is hard to remember all the shortcuts up front. So we'll go through loop cut first. Loop cut allows you to basically take a series of edges and split them down the middle. So you can see when I select the tool from the side and then scroll over here, it's going to preview a couple of your options. So for example, I can go over this one and you'll see that these 4 edges around the outside of the cube are kind of being split down the middle by this new loop of edges. So if I click, it will add in that loop, and you'll notice down here in the bottom left-hand side of the screen, there's this kind of minimized menu. So you can click on that to open it up, and it'll give you some more controls that you can adjust through here. So for example, you can increase the number of cuts, and it will equally space these out for you. You can also adjust the smoothness. A lot of the tools on the side will have a smoothness modifier, and basically this will allow you to adjust the shape of your model as well as adding in these cuts. So if I increase the smoothness right now, it will kind of inflate along these new loops that we've added in here. And you can just put this all the way up. It'll hard stop at 4, but you can manually type this in higher than that, and it will just keep going. For our purposes though, we want this set back down to 0. One thing to note though, if I go negative on this, you can see that right here, there's nothing to stop Blender from going all the way through the model inside and in one side and out the other and creating this intersection where you have these weird graphical glitches. It'll let you make this model, but if you tried to 3D print this model, it would go really badly. So you want to be mindful of your modeling, and just because you can make something physically look like that in Blender doesn't mean it can be recreated in the real world if you try and 3D print something that you're making. Another thing to note, so if I undo that loop cut and then go back here, if I go and click on this loop cut, instead of just clicking and immediately letting go, if I click and hold, I can drag side to side and place the loop specifically where I want it to be, which can be really helpful, especially when you're getting into more complicated things and you want to place a loop in only one specific spot and not just have to scroll through and add a bunch of loops all over the place. So, oh my gosh. One thing to keep in mind, for all of these tools on the side that have a small kind of arrow down to the side right here, you can click and hold on these tools, and this means that there are other options that you can toggle through here. So the default loop cut will just add in that standard loop. You can also do offset edge loop cut, where basically you select one set of edges that already exist and it will add a loop on either side of it. So if we did that right now and then select this one, you can see right here, it's adding in 2 edges on either side of that one loop. So this can be really useful as well, but it's a little bit more of a niche option, so you don't always need it. But yes, you'll want to add in loops whenever you're trying to select something smaller. So for example, right now, I'm in the face selection, so I can select this entire top face. Maybe though, I want to select just one corner of this cube. So what I could do is add in loop cuts to this side and this side, and then go back to my selection menu. And now if I go back to face selection and click here, I can select just one quarter of this top face. So adding in loop cuts is going to allow you to basically divide up your faces into smaller sections and allow you to select smaller bits at a time that you're trying to edit without adding in loops all across the entire model. So one of your main tools that you'll be using is the extrude tool. If you are familiar with CAD modeling programs, it's very similar to CAD modeling. So if I hit E while I have a face selected, it's going to extrude that face up. You'll notice that the Z axis was highlighted as soon as I pressed E. So if I hit Z twice, it's going to unhighlight that Z axis, and now I can extrude it and kind of free drag it around wherever I want with my mouse. And one thing to keep in mind here, if you hit E and you're dragging it up here and then you don't want it to go up here, and you hit right click to cancel it, it will snap back down to here, but it still created that extrude. So there is now a duplicate of that face right on top of the other one. So if I hit G right now and then drag it around, it looks like I'm extruding it again. So you always want to keep that in mind. If you hit E and then you cancel out with right click, it's still made the extrude, it's just in place. So there's a couple of reasons why you might want to do this. It can be really helpful if you're, say, trying to make an inset face. So I have that extrude in place right here. What I can do is hit S on the keyboard, and that'll allow you to scale stuff. And now I can scale this face right here in this plane and make kind of a smaller square. So now I have this smaller square in here, and if I hit E again, now I can extrude out this smaller square, or I could extrude it in and have kind of this cutout going into the cube like that. So there are times where you do want to extrude and keep it in place. Just be mindful that when you right click, it will snap it down, but it will still extrude. So if you hit undo because you want to undo your extrude, you're going to have to hit undo a couple times to make sure that you actually got rid of it and you didn't just have the extra face snapped on top of the other one. Another thing to keep in mind is there are a couple different options for extrude. So by default, you just have your extrude region. This is kind of your most general one, but there are a couple more specific extrudes that you can look at, and we'll look at those in the hold left click dropdown. So extrude along normals can be interesting. You'll see this kind of controller pops up and you can click on it. When they're all next to each other like this, they don't really do anything different, but say, for example, we select faces that are on opposite sides of the cube like this. So now if we do extrude along normals, you see you get this kind of weird effect where it doesn't extrude straight up, it extrudes out normally on all of those edges. So you see this one, normal to it is straight up, this edge normal to it straight out, this one normal to it is at this 45-degree angle. So you get this kind of unique geometry. We also have extrude individual. So if we do that, while we have two of these selected, it will extrude both of them straight out, but separate from each other. So if you do those other extrudes, you'll notice that these two edges were snapped together and they were connected. This one doesn't create that connection between the edges, they just go out separate from each other. So you can really quickly generate complex shapes with this, but a lot of times it's not explicitly what you're looking for because it does create this split between your two faces. So most of the time you're fine with just your normal extrude. And then there is one last, what's that?
Question. How are you selecting faces directly? Like what? Like clicking on them doesn't select them.
So you have to change into face selection mode. Usually by default, you'll be in vertex selection mode. If you want to switch to face selection, hit 3 at the top of your keyboard, and then you should be able to click on the faces. And if the selection is just not showing up properly, you can always hit W on your keyboard to switch into selection mode, and then your cursor should allow you to select things. So yeah, there is one more option that's a little bit weird. It's not really the most useful, but it's worth knowing that it exists. So extrude to cursor. I have this face selected, and then if I click over here, it's going to automatically just continue extruding to the cursor. So you can create really quick, bizarre shapes like this. So if you're just trying to sketch something out really fast, it can be useful for that, but you have a lot less control over it than you have with the others. So I usually don't use this, but you can use it if you're just trying to do something really fast. So that's the extrude tool. Now, there is another option for G for grabbing and moving your object around that exists specifically in your editing mode, which is really interesting. So if I hit 1 to go into vertex selection mode, what I can do is edit these vertices with context to the geometry that already exists here. So if I hit G twice, you'll see this kind of locks it in place. And instead of just being able to drag your object, this vertex, around wherever I want, I can drag it along the edges that already exist there. So if I drag it this way, you can see it goes along this edge. This way, it's going back along this diagonal edge. It can go along this edge. So this can allow you to kind of have finer control over this. So for example, this shape here, I have this kind of square cutout into here, but maybe I want these sides to be a nice even slope across them. So I can select that vertex, I can hit G twice, and I can drag it back along this edge until it kind of hits into that corner. And you can do that with all of these edges. And pull them back here, and now I have these nice sloped edges here. One thing to keep in mind though, those vertices are still overlapping with each other. So if you want to remove them, what you have to do is right click and then do dissolve. Actually, it's not dissolve merge, it's merge vertices. It's not super necessary. If you leave them overlapping like that and you try and print this, it'll still print okay. It might come up with some errors in your slicing software for your printer, but it'll probably be fine. But yeah, in general, you'd want to get rid of that. So you can always hit your space bar and start typing and do merge, and then do merge by distance. And it will actually delete out vertices that are overlapping with each other if you do that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you are, let's say, moving a vertice, in my case, it's snapping to preset points. Is there a way to disable that?
There is. So it's right underneath the zoom control overlay, actually. So right up here at the top of your screen, there's a couple options that aren't super obvious. So one of them right here is your transform orientation. So if I click on one of these vertices and then I select one of these control toggles, so for example, the move, this brings up these move arrows. By default, it's on global, but you can also do local and normal. So local and normal will allow you to have kind of different orientations for your things. You also have these. So this is when you rotate an object, for example, what it's rotating about. By default, it's set to your median point of whatever objects you have selected. You can also do rotating around the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is this kind of red and white speckled thing that's over at the center there. You can move that around and do some advanced editing with that, but we're not going to cover that today just because it gets really confusing. And then this magnet here, when that's highlighted, that's when your objects are going to snap to each other. So you'll see if I turn it on, when I drag this point now, it snaps to the grid lines on the ground. So if you uncheck that magnet, you should be able to have free range of control over it and won't snap to things. So snap can be useful for sometimes, but a lot of times you're going to want to turn it off unless you're specifically looking to use it. You also can increment what your snapping is snapped to. So for example, you can have it increment along the edge of the mesh at the bottom. You can have it snap to other vertices. either on the same model or on different models that you have in here, edges, faces, all these different options that you can play around with snap. But essentially, if you want your vertex to stick to something, you hit the snap button. And then proportional editing is the last thing that you can do. So if you click that, if I click proportional editing and then I hit G here, it has the, see, it will kind of grab these other vertices over here and drag them with it. So it changes more than just that point. It affects other geometry in your model. And you can adjust your drop off with that down here. You can have different drop off shapes and you can adjust more of the things down there. Those are some more advanced features that we don't really need to get into, but it is a good thing to know that they exist. Okay, another thing to keep in mind, if you're looking at Blender tutorials, a lot of times people are going to say go into X-ray mode, and you probably won't know what they're talking about the first time that you're looking at something like that. X-ray mode is this button that they have up here. So it's this one right here that has these kind of two overlapping squares. Oh, I just noticed these chats here. So I'll answer Nico's question. I don't know if he'll see it tonight, but whenever he gets back and sees the recorded video, Blender saves the entire scene. So if you hit save, everything that you have in here, all of your lighting setups, all of your edits that you've done to your model, everything will be saved, and then you can load in that whole scene again later. So X-ray mode, you enable it by hitting this button up here. And what this allows you to do is it basically makes all of your faces of your model kind of this transparent color. So you can see through your model, and seeing through it's not the important part. What's important is you can select through your model. So say, for example, I turn X-ray off and I go to a side view like this, and I do a click and drag and select over my model. Let's do face selection. I select the model and then I rotate around. You'll see it selected only the ones that were directly visible in that view. But if I go back into here, unselect things, and then hit X-ray mode, if I drag through here now and rotate around, you'll notice it selected everything through the whole model, which can be really, really useful, especially if you want to use a modifier. So for example, I can select all of these and I can hit delete, delete out these faces, and I have kind of half a box. I can add in a modifier and do a mirror modifier. Don't worry about what modifiers do or how to add them. We'll go into those later. But now that I have this modifier, I was able to cut out that box and add in half of it really quickly and easily. And now I can turn off my X-ray mode and do some changes and stuff to it. For example, I can do this and drag it and it'll affect both sides. So you can do stuff like that really easily by toggling into X-ray mode and selecting through your mesh. There are two other tools that are pretty useful that I will talk about here. So one is the inset faces. This accomplishes the same thing that we did earlier by selecting the face, extruding it in place, right-clicking to have it snap back into place, do S to scale it in. That same exact thing can be accomplished by using one tool. So it's this one over on the side, inset faces. If I click on a face and then hit inset, it brings up this kind of toggle here, and then I can just drag it in and immediately create this inset face. And this will work not only with squares, but more complicated shapes as well. You can also do this tool below it that's very helpful. This is the bevel tool. So if you're familiar with chamfers and fillets in a CAD program, that's the equivalent in Blender here. So if I hit 2 to go into edge selection mode, I can select these two edges here, for example, and then I can go onto bevel, and now I can drag this out and I can create a chamfer in effect right across this edge here. And you have your offset is essentially your width of your chamfer. And then let's say you wanted this to be a fillet and not just a flat chamfer across the side. What you can do is add more segments to it, and now it's a fillet. So if I add 31 segments, you get this nice rounded kind of filleted shape. And then profile controls exactly what this curve looks like. So if I go into the side view here, we can see that this is kind of a nice quarter circle with the 0.5 profile. You can also scroll that up and down to push it more into a square shape, or even make it kind of a cut fillet instead of a fillet on the corner right there. So you could do different values like that. You can scroll all the way up between 1 and 0, depending on how sharp you want that curve to be. And then default is 0.5, where it's just that nice, even quarter circle. So those are the basic tools that are really helpful to know in your editing tab. So we're going to go out of editing mode, hit tab again. Now we're back in our standard view. We actually lost one thing here. This face didn't stay selected. It might have. Okay. Okay, now we've got these nice kind of cutouts in here. It'll just be a little bit more interesting for what we want to achieve later on. Okay, so any questions about using the edit tools before we keep going? All right, cool. So the next thing that we want to talk about are modifiers. You saw a little sneak peek of that with the mirror modifier. There are a ton of modifiers in Blender. You don't need to know how all of them work, but if you want, if you're curious about them, there's basically tutorials on YouTube for every single feature in Blender, so you can always just search that up. But I'm going to cover a couple of the most useful ones. So probably the most useful modifier is Boolean. Boolean allows you to combine different shapes together. So for example, if I add in another shape here, so let's add in a UV sphere, drag that off to the corner. Let's say I want to combine these two shapes together. I can click on the one original model that we want to be combined with the other one and add a modifier onto it and select the Boolean option. And so you have your Boolean modifier here. There's not a whole lot of things that you can change about it. Basically, you have your different types of Boolean operations. You have difference, intersect, and union. Difference will cut out the other model from it. Union will combine it together. And intersect will basically be whatever region they overlap with. You'll be left with just that region. So we can take a look at what all of those different ones look like. So if we do union, for example, and then if I click on the object drop down here, I can select the sphere. And now if we look at this option here, we can hide the sphere. And this is what our object's going to look like. It basically is this original default cube that we messed with, and it has the sphere added onto it now. So if we toggle this, we can turn this modifier on and off. So we can see if we don't apply the modifier, the cube will still stay looking like this. If we hit this desktop looking button again, it'll show us what the modifier preview looks like. Don't worry about the weird graphical glitches here. That's just because it's still in the preview mode. As soon as you hit apply, it should fix those. So that is a Boolean union. You can also switch it to Boolean difference. So we'll have kind of a cutout shape inside of our object. And it will autofill in that gap there. It won't just have a hollow opening going inside of your object. And then intersect, you'll just be left with kind of the overlap between the two models. So let's say, for example, we do difference and then hit apply. Although it might have broken this model. Well, it should fill that in. For some reason, it doesn't like this sphere. But we won't worry about that right now. Basically, Boolean allows you to combine your different models together. So it can be really useful for you to kind of just throw primitives together and really quickly build out something without having to spend a whole lot of time worrying about making everything from one original file. You can add in a shape, you can do some editing to that, and then you combine it onto your main file. So say, for example, that you were making a video game character. Maybe you start off with a default cube and you make that into kind of a body shape, and then you make out an arm over to the side on a sphere, and then you want to add that arm on, then you can add in that sphere and Boolean union it onto your body, and now you have just one file again without having to worry about how you got your geometry going from a cube out to a sphere. So that's the Boolean modifier. Another one that's really helpful is subdivision surface. So subdivision surface is a pretty unique modifier to Blender. It allows you to very quickly create smoother geometry across your model. And it can have some really weird and unexpected effects sometimes that you wouldn't think it would create. So, for example, let's just bring in a normal default cube and drag this off to the side and look at that one on its own. And we'll add a subdivision surface modifier to it. So if we do this, you'll see this is one level of subdivision. You can see right here, this is the viewport level. You also have render level. So by default, it's going to do the render level one higher than your viewport level. This saves computation time in your viewport, so everything stays nice and fast, but you want to keep in mind that it's always slightly more subdivided in your rendering when it goes to actually make your final image. So in general, I like to have them matched together so that I don't switch to render and then forget that I had more subdivisions in the model than actually were showing up in the viewport here. So 2 subdivisions gives you this shape. And essentially, if you look at how it's doing this, 0 subdivisions, you just have your cube. 1 subdivision, it kind of splits your cube down all the sides. It adds a loop cut across every side, and then also rounds it across that cut. If you do 2, you'll notice it splits each of those with another loop cut and continues to round it. So it's essentially that same thing that we were doing before with a loop cut with rounding in it across your whole model. So this allows you to very quickly go to smooth geometry for sculpting purposes. So for example, let's say you want to make like a human arm to sculpt something out. What you can do is add in a new cube. Drag this over to the side. Okay, we have our new cube. We can go into edit, use our face mode, and we can do E a couple times, kind of drag out this shape. We can do 2. And one thing I forgot to mention in edit mode, if you hold Alt while you're in a selection mode, if you hold Alt and then click, it will select all of the shapes that go in kind of a continuous line. So for example, this edge, it continues in this whole edge loop all the way around the model. So if I hold Alt and select it, it grabs that whole loop and allows you to do really nice transforms like this. So I hit S now, I can narrow down that whole thing. So let's say we narrow this down a little bit, or maybe we expand that up a little bit. We narrowed this one down. We narrowed this one down even more. Come on. Okay, sometimes it doesn't like the very end of models and you have to select the face instead. So let's say this is our basic arm shape. It doesn't have to look great, but if we go out of the edit mode and then add in a subdivision surface modifier, it can very quickly become a more organic shape. See, it's a lot smoother now. If we zoom in close, we have a lot of polygons here that we can adjust with for sculpting. So it's a very unique modifier and very useful for going from a quick basic shape to a more organic shape for sculpting purposes. And it's so useful, in fact, that there is a shortcut for it. So if you hit Control-1 on your keyboard, again, this is 1 at the top of your keyboard and not on the number pad. So control 1 all the way up to control 5, it will add in a subdivision with the level of subdivisions in your modifier over on the side. But always remember to double check and see what subdivision difference there is between your viewport and your rendering. So if you do the shortcut one there, it will potentially give you a render that's lower quality than your viewport if you use, say, control 5. So be mindful of that. Always make sure that you have your render and viewports matching up on your subdivision amounts. And then a last modifier that we'll go through is decimate. So decimate allows you to basically do the opposite of subdivision surface. So if I hit apply here and I save this subdivision surface, I can hit decimate instead, and this will decrease the amount of faces on your model. So why you'd want to do this, maybe you have something that you subdivided a bunch of times so that you'd have a lot to work with for sculpting, and now you want to save it, and it's a couple million polygons, and it's going to save as a huge file. You can hit decimate to bring your file size down and have something that's a little bit easier to work with. So if I select this, this shape here and then hit the decimate modifier, you'll see, excuse me, right now we have 4,608 faces. And if I hit this ratio and then type in 0.5, it's going to cut those faces down in half. So now we have roughly half as many faces. We were at such a high face count that it's not immediately obvious what it's changing to this. So let's drag this even further down. You can click and drag across this to dynamically change it, but if you have millions of faces, I don't recommend dragging it because it's going to take a really long time to update between the original face count and the new one. So it's better for high face counts to just click and type in a number. But for relatively low things like this, in the low thousands, you can just drag it and you can see exactly how this is dynamically changing. So the lower we get, the more low polygon count we get, and it starts making rougher and rougher geometry across your model. So essentially, this is what you see happen in video games. Professional artists will do a really detailed high polygon count sculpting of a character, and then if they're making this character for, say, a mobile app that's 3D modeling based, they'll add in a decimate modifier like this and bring it way down. So the texture still looks really nice on it, but if you look at the 3D model, it's really low polygon counts. So you do your original modeling at very high polygon amounts, and then you bring it really down low for your exporting to keep the file size really low. And one last thing, if we go back into the subdivision modifier, so if we look at our default cube that we've kind of edited stuff around with on that, remember when we did the subdivision on it, it kind of looks weird. It kind of breaks it a little bit. If we look at the smooth fillet that we added across it, it adds this weird ribbing effect that we don't necessarily want. That's because it's using the Catmulley-Clark one where it rounds the edges as it adds them in. If you just do simple, it's not going to look like it changes anything. But if you go into, if you hit apply and then go into the tab mode, you'll see we have a bunch more lines added into it that we weren't expecting. So these basically, it just adds in an extra line between every line that already exists. It doesn't change the overall shape of your model, but it gives you more faces to work with. So if you wanted to add sculpting onto this, you could, for example, add on a subdivision 5 modifier to it with just a simple modifier, hit apply. And now if we go into tab again, we have, it's going to take a second because it has a lot more faces to it. If we go into tab now, we have tons and tons of faces, very, very small polygons across it. So now if we wanted to sculpt, we have a lot of polygons to work with and you can get some smooth sculpting. Whereas if we tried to sculpt with our original one where we had these big blocky shapes, it wouldn't sculpt as smoothly. And then one last feature that you can do with it. So let's say we add in a cube, we add on a subdivision modifier, we have the option to edit it before we apply the modifier. So if you have the modifier on, it's still over here, but you haven't clicked apply on it. If you click on that cube that we've now smoothed out and hit the tab button, you see we have this weird view that's kind of unique while the modifier is still not applied. So you can see the overall cube shape is still here, and then you can see inside of that cube what it's being smoothed and reduced down to. So this gives you the unique opportunity to edit the cube while seeing what it's going to smooth, what its smooth shape will end up looking like. So if I say grab this vertex point and then drag it out, you can see in real time what that shape will smooth down to. So you can get really interesting effects, and you can do all of your normal controls on this. So say I click on this one, I hit E to extrude it out. You can very quickly get these unique organic shapes, and you can see exactly what it's going to look like when you apply the modifier. So you have two different options for it. You can leave it where you have this kind of ghostly see-through look where you have the cube on the outside and you can see the smooth modifier one on the inside, or you can go over into your modifier tab on the side and you can click this final option, this triangle one, and what that will do is it will suck these vertices that you're editing, it'll suck them down onto that surface like this. It just basically depends on your preference which one you like better. Some people like selecting the faces directly on your model. Some people like not having that visible and like being able to see the hard edges on the outside. Basically a personal preference. But yeah, you always have to apply the modifier if you want to make it a permanent change onto your mesh. Any questions about modifiers and editing before we go on to the next step? All right, cool. So the next thing that we're going to cover is sculpting. So sculpting is one of the nicest features about Blender. It allows you to get really nice, smooth control over your modeling that would basically be impossible to do in pretty much all CAD programs. It uses the geometry on your model though. So for example, we'll edit this one and then we'll edit this cube that we added a bunch of divisions onto, and you'll see the stark difference between the sculpting in them. One thing to keep in mind, if you have a subdivision modifier on an object, always make sure you apply it before you do any sculpting. Otherwise, when you go into sculpting and then you come back, all the changes you do in sculpting won't actually stay on your model because the subdivision wasn't applied before you did your sculpting onto it, and it can be really annoying and confusing. So just apply any subdivision modifiers you have before you start sculpting on a model. So to start sculpting, you just click onto the model and then go over onto the sculpting tab. So we have it right here. Now, it can be kind of annoying to have two models in the same view like this. So if we go back to layout, what we can do is select this model and then do Shift H, which will hide everything except for this model. It's basically like isolate. And if you do Alt H, it'll unhide everything that was hidden. One thing to keep in mind though, Alt H will unhide everything. So if you had some things hidden that you wanted to stay hidden, you're going to have to hide those again. But yeah, we can do Shift H to basically isolate this out, and then we can go back into our sculpting one and not worry about anything else in our scene kind of getting in our way and being unsure about which thing we're sculpting on. So your sculpting layout looks a little bit different than your standard editing layout. You have a bunch of tools along the side still, and then you have more options along the side over here. So by default, you're going to be brought into kind of the options menu over here that allows you to do some changes on whatever brush you have selected and then adjust some of your other settings down here. So the first thing that you'll want to adjust is your symmetry option down here. By default, it's going to have the x-axis symmetric. This isn't a symmetric model, so having symmetry on doesn't really make sense, but we'll go ahead and turn it on when we go onto the cube later because the cube is symmetric and it's more helpful there. So it's going to load you into the drawing brush by default. This is kind of your most basic one. If I click and drag across it, it just kind of raises things up. And you'll notice this is what I'm talking about, where you need to add in more subdivisions across your model, because right now I'm sculpting and you can see it's increasing stuff up, but it can only add in as much detail as you have in your subdivisions. So you can see it's raising this up, but it still is very, very blocky. So if I wanted this to be a lot smoother, I'd want to create smaller subdivisions. So say if I go down onto this area where subdivisions are a little bit smaller, if I sculpt here, it's a little bit smoother. There's a little bit more detail there. So if we swap over back into the layout, Alt-H to unhide everything, and then we isolate our cube that we've made changes to, we go into sculpting on this cube has a lot more faces on it. So if we sculpt here, you see you get this nice smooth effect. We added on tons and tons of faces. If you zoom in small on this cube, you can see closely that there are very small faces right here, and you can get this nice smooth drawing effect. You get a lot more natural sculpting. So we can go ahead and turn back on our mirroring, and you can see it shows you where the other point is going to be. So say we do this Y mirroring across the Y plane. If I draw here, it'll kind of mirror it across that plane directly for us. So that's your default drawing brush. It's not really the greatest brush. It's kind of generic. The one I usually use when I'm adding on more material is this clay strips brush. It's a little bit nicer. You can kind of add on more material more quickly this way. You can kind of stack them up on top of each other. It looks like it's really gross and messy, like you're getting all these weird jagged diagonal shapes across it, but it's really not that bad. And the reason why is because of this next brush that we'll look at, which is the smooth brush. It does exactly what you think it will. Basically, it'll take all these hard edges and weird overlapping things that we have, and it'll kind of smooth those out, get rid of those creases. So what I like to do is add in new volume with the clay strips brush, and then smooth out the shapes that we added with the smoothing brush. And you can always increase the strength across the top. You can increase the radius to have it affect a larger area of your model. Be mindful that when you have really high polygon counts, if you ask it to smooth across all of these polygons, it's going to take a second to do this because it's a lot of calculations that your computer is trying to do. And to that end, most people that do sculpting a lot digitally will want to use a drawing tablet of some kind. I highly recommend it if you're actually looking to do this more often than just a once or twice type thing. You can get a lot of different types of drawing tablets on the market. I highly recommend the brand Huion, Huion. It's a Chinese branded tablet, but it's one of the highest quality ones out of the Chinese options. So they're really cheap, but they're still really high quality. And they have a lot of different ones available. So they have all the way down from the lowest base level that are like less than $100. There's no screen or anything. It's just a responsive type trackpad with a pen that you can write on, all the way up to the fancy ones where it's basically a second monitor that you attach onto your computer and it has pressure sensitivity built into it. So if you're serious about doing sculpting or modeling type stuff like that, it's worth looking into a drawing tablet as well, because you can turn on these pressure sensitivity options up here and get more dynamic sketching and brushes across your scrapes. So we've covered the basic drawing brush, we covered the clay strips brush, we covered the smoothing brush. Another one that's pretty interesting is the crease brush. This one, think of it as a similar thing. It's a similar effect as if you took your fingernail and kind of dragged it through some clay. You get this kind of divot pressing into it, and depending on how small of a radius you make it, it will be a sharper divot. So if we turn the strength up, we turn the radius low, it'll press deeper in and be a smaller line. Where if we do the opposite, bring the strength down lower, bring the radius up higher, it is a smaller press in. You can see it's kind of slowly deforming the side of this box here. So you can play with the strength and radius options to get more dynamic effects across it. So one thing that you can do with that, let's say we add in a crease like this, and then we want to harden this up some. So right now it's kind of soft still. What we can do is we can go to this pinch brush here. And pinch brush basically pulls together your nearby faces. So if we go in the bottom here and draw this pinch brush across it, you'll see it will start sharpening this bottom edge. So now if we zoom in closer here, we see that this is basically coming down to a point, whereas before it was kind of a soft curved bottom, now it's coming down to a point. We can do the same thing on this top edge. We can go across with this pinch, and now we're starting to get this sharp top edge. So this allows you to make more rigid edges onto a sculpt that might be otherwise a little bit more freeform. So if you're trying to model something that has hard edges in it, so say something like an insect that has a hard shell, or a crab, or something like that, where you have organic shapes but still hard edges, it can be a really nice combination to do a crease to kind of get your initial divot, and then use the pinch option to really sharpen up those edges that you've added on. You can do the same thing up here, so you can see this edge on the top was kind of softened out by our smoothing brush. We can always try and strengthen that back up a little bit with the pinching. You'll notice though that it's still kind of a dynamic and freeform brush, so this edge isn't a nice straight line anymore. It's kind of wavy, and depending on how precise you are with your control, you can get it a little bit more linear, a little bit more wavy. And then the last brushes that we're gonna look at are these deform brushes. So you have three different options: grab, elastic deform, and snake hook. These are kind of your primary ones for doing big changes to your model. Grab allows you to basically take a selection of faces that are under your radius and pull them out to the side. So for example, I could increase this radius up a little bit bigger, and you see this inner shape, that inner circle. That's what you can grab, and everything inside of there you can kind of pull it off to the side. So you can very quickly do some dynamic changes. So you can see this looks more like a face now that we're doing this grab to it. This kind of looks like eyes or ears or something. You can do this dynamic changing, playing around with your shapes really easily, really quickly with grab. The elastic deform is similar in appearance to grab, but it's almost like the proportional editing that we had earlier, where you see when I pull with this, it pulls more than just that small radius with it. So if I grab down here, you'll see it pulls along the entire model, not just the small radius. So it's like a grab tool that also affects the rest of your model. And then the last one is snake hook. Some people really, really like snake hook. I personally don't like it very much, but it's worth knowing that it exists. Basically, if you want to add on some kind of shape that sharply diverges off from your model, like a spike or something, you can use the snake hook tool to just pull it straight out of your model. So say I want these to be ears that come up onto some kind of point or something. I can click here and use snake hook and just literally pull this out really long, really easily. The reason I don't like it very much is twofold. One, if you zoom in close here, you'll notice it's not creating new polygons. It's taking the polygons that were right there in that small point and extending them all the way out here. So this long stretch right here doesn't have almost any polygons in it. It's only like 2 or 3 polygons across this whole thing. So if you try and do sculpting onto here after you've snake hooked it out, you're not going to have a lot of control. So say, for example, if I use the smooth tool on this, you're going to notice that it's going to shorten it down very, very quickly because there's only a handful of polygons, and it basically doesn't have a lot of room for the smooth tool to act. So it will very, very quickly kind of reduce itself down. And the other one is it very quickly breaks your model. So if we undo that a couple times, and let's do the snake hook tool again, drag this out, I can just keep dragging this, and you'll notice that we get this shape that might be interesting visually, but if you look at it, you have all these weird graphical glitches across it. This basically means that your faces have been stretched really, really thin across the entire model, and if you try to 3D print this, it's not going to work at all. This is completely broken geometry, and the snake hook tool is really easy to accidentally break everything with. So it can be useful for some circumstances, but I would recommend being cautious with that one. So those are the overview of the brushes. You can customize these out to get more specific effects. And there's a couple others in here that we didn't really talk about, but for the most part, those ones are your most general use, most helpful brushes for your general purpose sculpting. Any questions on sculpting before we go into our final set? All right, cool. So let's go into our final topic for tonight, which is rendering. So rendering is one of the main reasons that you might use Blender. Maybe you made out a really nice model of something in a CAD program and you don't want to make any changes to the model in Blender. You just want to make it look pretty in a nice image that you can send to somebody to show how it all looks, make it look very photorealistic without spending a ton of money to have it actually made. So we can go back to our layout tab, and what we can do is add in texture onto this. So there's a couple things that we want to do first before we actually set up our rendering. So let's unhide everything and then hide. If you just hit H while you have something selected, that will automatically hide it in your viewport. So now we just have our cube selected. If we hit 0 on the number pad, that'll bring us into our camera view. We can see what's in frame. So it looks like the cube is pretty much in frame. Maybe we want to rotate it around though, because we were saying this kind of looks like a face or something now. So let's maybe rotate this around the x-axis some, and then around the y-axis, and then around the z-axis. Now we have it kind of looking towards our camera. Okay, so yeah, now we have that in view. One thing to keep in mind, right now, this is all just floating in a void. The background by default in Blender is just kind of this dark gray empty space. So if you render it right now, you're just going to have this empty space behind it. So if you want it to look like it's sitting on a table or has shadow or something, we can really quickly add in something for that by just adding in kind of a default plane. So first things first, we're gonna grab this, hit G, hit Z to move it up on the Z-axis, and we'll move this up 1 unit. So now if we look at it from the side, it's a little bit sitting more on this plane. It's not quite on this plane line, so we're gonna kind of bring it up just a little bit more. Okay, so now it's kind of sitting on this grid plane that we have at the bottom. Now we can add in kind of a backdrop for it. So if we hit Shift A, we can add in a mesh, we can add in a plane, and this will add in this flat plane at the bottom. We can hit S to scale this up bigger. And now what we want to do is just add in some sides on this to make this kind of like a photo booth. So if we go into 0, we can make sure that this is all covering it up. So say, for example, if we hadn't scaled it up, if we had it sitting on this, there's still some of this void kind of visible around the edges. So we want to make sure we scale it up big enough so that at least these front corners of the camera are kind of taken up by this bottom plane. So now what we can do is select the plane, hit Tab to go into the edit mode, hit 2 to go into edge selection mode, and then we can select these back 2 edges and hit E and Z, and now we can just drag this up. And now we have kind of like a photo booth that we've done where we have 3 sides of this kind of cube set up, and we can use that as kind of a backdrop. And right now we have these hard edges, but we could even go in and select all these edges and add on a nice bevel to them, add on some more segments, and make this kind of a softer curve so it's not as harsh of an edge, so it doesn't look like it's sitting on like a table in a corner of a room or something. So we can tab out of edit mode. Now we have our nice smooth kind of backdrop. And what we can do, if we want to preview how this is going to look rendered, what we can do is we have these view options up here. So there's 4 different options. One of them is your wireframe mode. So this doesn't have any color. It's just showing your mesh itself. So we can see this looks almost solid black because there's so many mesh points that the lines are overlapping with each other and basically just making it look shaded. But if we look at the plane that we just made, that's a lot simpler. We can see it's just kind of this overall wireframe. This is kind of your default one. This is just a generic gray kind of shaded material, so it gives you a little bit of sense of shadows and light on it, but it doesn't actually have any colors that we might add on. The third option is texture preview. So right now these are both just generic white textures that it loads in by default, and we can go ahead and change these up. And then this one is in-canvas rendering. So if we click on that one, now it actually does rendering. So we can see it has a shadow, it's being cast by this light that loads in by default, and we get kind of a quick preview. So you can use this in canvas rendering to get an idea of how your model's looking before you actually spend time actually rendering out a full image. You can just get a quick preview of it. So we'll just go ahead and leave the backdrop as that kind of white default material, and then we'll add in a new material onto our kind of weird cube shape thing. So one thing to keep in mind before we move on to the actual adding of textures, there are two different rendering engines in Blender. So if you click on this camera shape on the side, this brings you into your rendering settings for it. So Eevee is what we have right now. Eevee is a really fast and powerful renderer. So we can see right now, this is rendering in real time. As I rotate around, you see there's like a little bit of blurriness happening with the edges. Basically, as soon as I'm moving this, it's immediately recalculating everything in the scene and putting it back into place. So you can get really fast renders with Eevee that look really nice. One thing to keep in mind though, that's a major drawback for Eevee, it's just approximating this. It's taking a bunch of computational shortcuts to get you here. So if you want something that's very accurate with how light is actually playing out in your scene, you're going to want to use the other rendering engine. And we'll talk about that one now. So Cycles is the full computational rendering engine in Blender. You'll see it takes a second to go. And basically what this does is it takes your light source and it calculates the light path from that light source to all the different objects in your model over and over again, and it traces where that light goes. So you get much more realistic effects this way. So you get better shadows. If you have things like metal or glass that are reflective or transparent, you get real good, you get realistic effects with Cycles. If you do Eevee, it just approximate that. So if you do something like a mirror or a transparent piece of glass in Eevee, you're going to get weird graphical errors on your models because it doesn't actually trace where the light is going through those. One thing to keep in mind, you're going to get these weird kind of like speckles with Cycles. So basically, the higher you turn up your iterations through it, the less speckles you're going to get. So right now we have it set as 32 path tracings in your viewport. If you do the full render, it'll actually do 128 of them. But we can actually change this up. So if we do 64 and then hit enter, you'll see right now it's calculating more paths, and it will slowly start filling in some of these gaps. So if we zoom in closer, you'll see it's going to calculate this in faster. Now, one thing to keep in mind, by default, as soon as you switch to Cycles, it's going to use your CPU on your computer to calculate this. This isn't ideal because your CPU is good at calculations, but it's not explicitly meant for calculating rendering type stuff. That's why you have a GPU. That's why you pay for a more expensive one from NVIDIA or an other brand like that. So if you have a nice GPU, you can hit GPU compute, and it's going to use that instead and render things much faster. So now if I zoom around out here, you'll see that the path tracing sample up here, this counter is going to go through all of those samples faster than if it was on the CPU compute. So those are your different options. If you just go to this one, your texture preview, you don't get your shading effects, but you can get a basic idea of what your textures look like. So let's say that you had a really fancy texture that you painted on this, you brought this into Photoshop or some other program where you can do 3D painting, and you painted on different shapes onto this. You could see those physical color shapes on here. You just won't have your shadow effects on it from your light until you go into your render preview mode. So if we want to change around the texture, what we can do is we can go onto this shading tab up at the top. So the shading tab is going to allow us to edit our object a little bit better, and we can dynamically change out our textures on it. One thing to keep in mind, by default, a lot of times in Blender, when you go into shading, it's not going to have anything showing up here because your node networks are turned off. So if you go into compositing, you're going to want to click this Use Nodes button at the top of compositing, and then you can go back to shading. And now if we go back to shading and click on this, we should have node networks showing up on here. So if we hit new, we can hit a new material onto this object, and now we have our nodes. Nodes are one of the most powerful features of Blender. These give you like basically total control over your texturing and your shading. It can get really, really complicated, so I'm gonna keep it simple here. If you look at professional people using Blender, they have these really zoomed out node networks that have 50 or 100 nodes all connected together, all feeding into each other, doing really complicated shading effects. But you don't have to do that for basic things. So if you just use your default one, it gives you this principled BSDF. And you have a bunch of options that you can control through here. So you can use your base color. If you click on that, you have your nice familiar color wheel. You can change out your color, and you see behind me, the cube is kind of changing its color dynamically. We can change whatever color we want here. You can also change it between different options. So you can do RGB, so you can type in an RGB value. You can type in a hex code. You can do hue saturation value with your alpha, whatever you want to do here. You can dynamically change your color around. So let's do something maybe like a dark blue color. So now we can zoom in and we see we have this. We have some kind of shininess on it, on the surface. Right now it kind of looks like a plastic maybe. If you want to change this around, maybe we want this to be kind of like an anodized blue metal. What we can do is change the specular. So specular is essentially how shiny the surface is. Right now it's set at 0.5, which is kind of middle of the ground. If we turn this up, it's going to make it more and more shiny. And if you adjust the metallic as well, that will kind of adjust the background of your object, basically how much light is absorbed into it. So if it's at 0, you see you kind of have these soft effects onto it. It looks kind of light all over. If you start turning up the metallic, you get these harder edges. It starts getting more reflective. If you put something else in here, you'll start seeing reflections of it in it, the more metallic you get it. And then you can continue pushing this by turning down the roughness. Right now it's set to middle of the ground roughness, so that's kind of just like a matte look to it. If you start turning this roughness down, you see things start looking really shiny now. So this looks like this nice polished anodized blue metal really quickly and easily. And you see you have full control over this. You can turn this down really dull and rough, get this really basic blue shape that looks not very shiny at all the way down to these really highly polished ones where it looks very shiny, very metallic. And there's a bunch of other things that you can change around in here. We're not really going to go through any of them because, like I said, this can get super, super complicated. But basically, this achieves what we were looking for. We wanted kind of a shiny metal look. So that's good. We can go back into our layout tab now. We can make sure that we have everything lined up. So if we go into 0, this is our camera view again. You see right now our model is a little bit out of frame of our camera. So we have a couple options that we can do for that. If we select the camera itself, I selected it just by hitting this edge. You can also rotate out and click on the camera out here. If we select the camera, we can go into the camera editing settings right here. And we can adjust the focal length, for example. So this is basically the zoom on your camera, so we can zoom out. Keep in mind though, you always have perspective on unless you change it down to orthographic or panoramic options. Perspective is the default. So you'll notice this starts getting kind of warped around the edges out here as you start zooming out because of the perspective. So you don't want to mess around with that too much. You can also shift your camera left and right with these shift X and Y, up and down. You can also adjust your clipping. So if you have a really, really big scene, so let's say we have a huge scene that has stuff all throughout here and we have a camera all the way back here, it's going to auto clip things that are off in the distance just to save you memory. So this can be helpful. It's a helpful way to think of it if you've ever played Minecraft. When you have your blocks way off in the distance not loading, there's kind of that blue mist. It's the same effect happening here. It's basically cutting stuff off that's really far away and not rendering that to save you computational power. So basically anything that's super, super close to the camera, 0.1 away from the camera, it won't render that. Anything that's really far away from the camera, it won't render that either. By default, these are pretty low values, but you can always increase your clipping way. So you can turn this way up so things in the distance will be captured into your render. It's just going to take longer because remember, it's bouncing the light all the way to your furthest point and back for every cycle that it goes through. So if you have 256 cycles and your clipping is set way off in the distance, you're going to have to expect a really long render time. So by default, it's set to 100. You don't really have to adjust that if you're just using your default settings. So that's fine. If you go into your window view here, you'll actually see things start to be cut off in your view here. So if we turn the clipping way down, you can see, for example, this is what it'll look like if the clipping is cutting off your part. So this part is within the range, the part behind it is not, so it's just not rendering it at all. So that is why you'd want to increase your value. So say, for example, you have a bigger scene, this part back here is being slightly cut off. That's why you would increase your clipping if you have those weird effects like back there where it's something that you want it to show up, but it's not showing up by default. So we look here, our part looks okay. It's visible in our camera view now. The last thing that we want to do before we do any rendering is just go back to this option here. This is your output option. And this is where you can select how nice of a render you're going to do. So you have your resolution, and this basically allows you to adjust the size and resolution of your image right now. So you could adjust it so it's 1080 by 1080, and this will give you a square rendering view, or you could take this all the way up to a 4K render, but the default 1920 by 1080 is fine for now. This should render pretty quickly. So basically, you can adjust your resolution really fast right there. And then when you're all set to go, always do an in-canvas preview just to make sure everything's looking all right, just to finalize it up. So take a look around. It's looking pretty nice. If you're ready to go, you want to save your render to actually save it as an image file. You press F12 on your keyboard. And that's going to bring up this other view and start rendering. And it does this process where it basically goes through chunk by chunk and just renders out a section, and it'll go through your whole image. And depending on how high quality you make the image, how many ray tracing paths you have, this could take longer. It could be a bigger section, but basically you can watch it in real time, trace through all of these render things. And then once it's done, you can hit this image option up here and save your image down directly onto your desktop. So yeah, that is basically your walkthrough of how you make an object from your basic editing controls, your sculpting, setting stuff up and rendering. It's a pretty straightforward walkthrough. I know we covered a lot of ground tonight, so if you guys have any questions, if you want me to go back and cover something, let me know. That's it for all the stuff that I wanted to cover tonight. So I'm just going to throw it out to you if you guys have any questions, anything that you want me to cover in more detail, anything you missed or wanted more clarification on, any things that you see around the side that you are wondering, what does that do? And you want me to click on it and kind of look through it with you, let me know. So yeah, anything that you guys want to know?
And that is the end of the recorded workshop. If you have any questions or you'd like to give feedback, if anything stood out to you, make sure to leave a comment with that stuff. We'd love to hear it. And look forward to the next video in this workshop series.